Hello and welcome to Reading Theory. This is a podcast where we read and discuss theory. For each episode, we select an essay, read it out loud, a few paragraphs at a time, and we discuss it as we go. In this episode, we will be reading Silence is a Commons by Ivan Illich. This essay was first presented at a symposium in Japan in 1982. Ivan Illich was a Catholic priest who lived from 1926 to 2002. He was notably critical of the institutions and practices of modernity, with particular concern for matters of freedom, dignity, and self-sufficiency. This text is particularly interesting to us because it brings up the all-important notion of the commons and the forms in which it can exist in our contemporary technological society. There's a lot to talk about, so we've broken up this episode into 3 parts. This is part 1 of 3. Let's get started. I'm going to start reading. Silence is a Commons by Ivan Illich. Subtitle: Computers are doing to communication what fences did to pastures and cars did to streets. Minasan, gladly I accept the honor of addressing this forum on science and man. The theme that Mr. Tsuru proposes, the computer-managed society, sounds an alarm. Clearly, you foresee that machines which ape people are tending to encroach on every aspect of people's lives, and that such machines force people to behave like machines. The new electronic devices do indeed have the power to force people to, quote-unquote, communicate with them and with each other on the terms of the machine. Whatever structurally does not fit the logic of machines is effectively filtered from a culture dominated by their use. The machine-like behavior of people chained to electronics constitutes a degradation of their well-being and of their dignity, which, for most people, in the long run, becomes intolerable. Observations of the sickening effect of programmed environments show that people in them become indolent, impotent, narcissistic, and apolitical. The political process breaks down because people cease to be able to govern themselves and they demand to be managed.
All right.
So we're going to pause for some, there's a lot to unpack here, right? I want to start out with saying he gave this talk in 1982. So
Yeah.
this is long before the web existed. And so what I think is really interesting, he's talking about electronic communication long before we came to rely on electronic communication. So I think it's very prescient. So this was a talk that he gave at a Congress in Japan in 1982.
Do we have any idea what specific technology he was talking about if he wasn't talking about the internet? Telephones, maybe? Like cell phones? Did cell phones exist in 1982? I feel so young right now. I'm so sorry.
No, it's I was thinking about that because the web didn't come online until 1991. There was an internet in 1982, but it was all text-based, right? It wasn't fully accessible.
We already had personal computers even, and before that we had mainframes. So I easily see what he's getting at here. That that a lot of bureaucratic work and personal organization happened through the computer, and people were spending more and more time just sitting at their computers instead of, I don't know, having contact with each other, something like that, I guess. And more and more, I mean, this is something that's happening all the time. With, I don't know how negative some parts of that is, to be honest. I would have to think.
A lot of parts are not negative. Like when you think about it, the 3 of us would have never talked if it wasn't for the internet or any types of technology. But I think where it gets in the way of real communication is when it gets over the communication you would have with the people in the real life, the people who live near you. I have so many friends who I only talk about online, even though it's like I don't know, 20-minute drive, or it's dumb. my entire mode of communication have been subsumed. Is that a word? Subsumed by the machine. That's what I think Illich is getting at.
Yes, I would like to focus on the two sentences from what was read and try to think about them more. So there was this: the new electronic devices doing it have the power to force people to communicate with them
Yeah.
and with each other on the terms of the machine. Whatever structurally does not fit the logic of machines is effectively filtered from a culture dominated by their use. So the question for me is, do you have any example of what type of uh, what would not fit the logic of the machine, right? In the computer dominated culture. Do you see anything like that?
Yeah, I think what he's getting at here, and when we get to the rest of the essay, I think we can look at historical examples. I think that, we can think of what the Industrial Revolution did to the working class, right? And I guess I think we can reference Engels here with these ideas, right? The condition of the working classes. What did conformity to these machines during the Industrial Revolution, what did that do to artisans, for example, and the way they went about working and doing their labor? So I think that there's also something deeper here, right? Like it's a systemic critique of
Yeah,
where,
it's not a critique of technology at all.
yeah,
Well,
yeah, sort of what system is it upholding, and what structures
yeah.
are the machines upholding?
Yes. So I have this one question. Can you give like one example of what does not fit the logic of the machine that got filtered from a culture? Do you have any example of this
Yeah.
phenomena
So
happening?
so
Like
I
specific, example.
Yeah, I think like maybe loom, for example, fabric textile workers, for example. I think like if we go back to the Industrial Revolution and we think about how the life and culture of textile workers changed, right? It went from being um, creating fabrics, right? The loom before these machines were created to do all of this labor mechanically. This was an artisan process, right? That was where people were in control of their own labor. It was something, there were guilds, things, skills were passed on between family members. And so that that whole culture, right, of artisan producers got filtered out in around the Industrial Revolution, right? Once we got machines to replace all of this production, right? And it's I mean, it's part of a bigger process, right? Because it's taking the means of production away from it's connected to that too, right? We're going to get into
Yes,
Marx.
I see. And so I wonder, would you agree that machines sort of force you to think more in a way of where you create a pattern and try to reproduce it as much as possible, maybe? Maybe that's if you try to that because of the more machines are propagated, the more people try to do this type of process because that's where machines excel. They help you when you have created some form, you can just mass produce it through the machine. You can just produce in big quantities one specific thing.
I think that there's definitely a process of like uniformization when you try to automate a process. Like you're gonna get the same thing every single time. But at the same time, when it's so easy to make a single item, it's also easy to make small variations in the item.
I think that's a big part of automation indeed. Yeah, like it's sort of that's interesting to be honest. Yeah, like
Something
and
interesting
the,
about automation is that it makes us like incapable of doing the actual work. Without machines these days, we're not much. Like you said earlier, Anna, the textile worker, like how big of a percentage of the world is capable of doing, I don't know, a shirt from a plant these days?
I think we should put a pin in that. I hate
Yeah.
that
Yes.
expression, but here I am saying that because I think that idea comes up again, right? Like how much control we have. I think it comes down to control over our things, over our tools,
Yeah.
right? And how we use them.
Who
Um,
has control over the tools?
yeah, so there's two ideas. I think just kind of following that thread of automation, I think maybe one thing that comes up is maybe another term to throw in is scalability, right? I think
Mm.
that's one thing that, in a capitalist system, we want to be able to scale production, right? Because we need that excess, that surplus value, right?
Yes.
And so that's where the question comes in of using, like, within a capitalist construct, right? The idea of using machines usually is for the purpose of scaling in order to create that excess, that surplus, right? And so I think one thing we want to get at is not the critique of using machines per se, but maybe the logic of how we develop them. And within our system, we develop machines according to the logic of creating a surplus, right? And so we want to scale things and we want to automate in order to scale things rather than to make our lives better as they sell things to us, right? That's how it's sold to us, right? Machines make our lives easier, but actually what's happening is they're being created to mass produce. So that's connected to the other idea I wanted to bring up. So one of Ivan Illich's seminal books is called Tools of Conviviality. And so in that book, he does this full kind of critique of tools, how tools are designed, how we use tools, and just sort of the power that's embedded in how in the tools that we're forced to use. Well, maybe not forced to, but yeah, I guess maybe forced to, right? Like we have certain software that we all have to use and that we all have to conform to.
Says she on Zoom.
Yes.
But yeah, in that book, Convivial Tools, he gives 4 criterias for what convivial tools are actually. I have them right here. He says convivial tools are, number 1, robust and durable, which is something that is not the case right now with, I don't know what it is in English, obsolescence programmée. Programmed obsolescence, like, maybe. Yeah, that. Number 2, preserve or enhance ecosystems, and we will get into ecology later. Number 3, level unequal power dynamics, which is also not done right now. And number 4, empower users, which is more arguable, more like relative, I feel. But the first 3 are really like showing that this is not what we have right now with our tools. Our tools are not robust, they are not durable, they do not preserve our enhance ecosystem, and they do not level unequal power dynamics.
Yeah, that's a good outline. And I think important because I think that work kind of underlines a lot of his thinking here. So it's good to have that context.
What would you say about? Well, the Illich says that that machine-like behavior of people change to electronics specifically constitutes degradation of the well-being, etc. And he ends this by saying that those people, they demand to be managed. So they lose ability to govern and they demand to be managed. How do you see that happening?
This kind of comes back to what we were talking about with the example of someone can't make a shirt from scratch, right? Like from plant materials anymore, right? And so I wonder, a lot of this has to do with the way our society is set up with the specialization of labor. But it's done in such a way that people are kind of passively accept that.
Well, we kind of just know only a little bit of the whole process, and then we can't do anything with that little bit of the whole process. Like, sure, I know how to transform some transformed product into some other transformed product, but I cannot survive with this, not without being inbricked in that larger systems that manage me.
Yeah. This is a point he actually brings up later on too, right? That in the idea of enclosure is kind of limits people's ability to provide for themselves. Yeah, I think that's part of it, is that we're trapped in this system where we're interdependent, right? And we have to question whether that interdependency necessitates passivity and hierarchical systems ultimately, which is what passivity leads to. All right, on to the next section of the reading. Reading. I congratulate Asahi Shimbun on its effort to foster a new democratic consensus in Japan, by which your more than 7 million readers become aware of the need to limit the encroachment of machines on the style of their own behavior. It is important that precisely Japan initiate such action. Japan is looked upon as the capital of electronics. It would be marvelous if it became for the entire world the model of a new politics of self-limitation in the field of communication, which, in my opinion, is henceforth necessary if a people want to remain self-governing. Electronic management as a political issue can be approached in several ways. I propose at the beginning of this public consultation to approach the issue as one of political ecology. Ecology, during the last 10 years, has acquired a new meaning. It is still the name for a branch of professional biology, but the term now increasingly serves as the label under which a broad, politically organized general public analyzes and influences technical decisions. I want to focus on the new electronic management devices as a technical change of the human environment, which, to be benign, must remain under political and not exclusively expert control. I have chosen this focus for my introduction because I thus continue my conversation with those 3 Japanese colleagues to whom I owe what I know about your country. All right, let's pause to unpack this. We need to unpack political ecology.
I think a good point to start with the term of ecology is it's broadly the study of a subject with its environment. And that can take multiple form. In the case of political ecology, it's going to be the political subject with its political environment, which means us, political subjects like human beings, and the way we live.
So I wish that I had read more Murray Bookchin because
he's a big ecology guy.
Okay, so I wonder. I had this one idea where okay, let's see. So ecology is about environment, right? And political ecology. I don't. Do you feel like this is the same as social ecology? I don't know if it's the same idea. Is it the same idea? Because
No, social ecology would be, I think, maybe more broad, but it might include political ecology.
I think so to me it seems like he just uses ecology to mean environment, and political ecology means some political environment. To me it seems like it's something like that, to be honest, because he writes I want to focus on the new electronic management devices as a technical change of the human environment, which to be begin must remain under political and not exclusively expert control. So I feel like, as he writes before that, ecology has acquired a new meaning. It's a label under which a broad, politically organized general public analyzes and influences technical decisions. So basically, I sort of think about this how we can say there are technical ecosystems. Have you heard about that? That there's like Linux ecosystem.
Yeah.
We use this type of names, these type of biologically influenced terms to mean sort of systems where people interact with each other to some extent. And I feel like that's the meaning of political ecology, to be honest. It seems to me like there's nothing that much concerning the biological environment here. It's just he means political environment by political ecology. At least that's how I sort of read him here. So I feel like it's something like this, to be honest.
So I think what we want to get at though is something more broad. I don't think we need to get into sort of the technical definition of terms, right? Because I feel like the term ecology, we've already kind of nailed this idea, right? That it's about interactions with the system. And I also feel like this connects quite a bit with what guys like Murray Bookchin talked about with the idea of social ecology, right? And where social ecology might be a bigger picture of how we relate human interactions with the environment.
Yeah, so I think about this that it tries to sort of throw out anthropocentric worldview by grounding this discussion in like whole of the environment.
Right.
You can easily try to just, especially concerning the rest of the essay, where it's to some extent about not treating the environment as the resource. I think I don't remember that. I think it's relevant. I think it's relevant to question the anthropocentric worldview.
Yeah, that's exactly it. I think that's very much kind of this idea that politics isn't disconnected from the bigger picture of where we're situated, right? Our ecology.
Yeah.
He does get at sort of this idea of how we treat our environment, and maybe that's also connected with how we treat one another, right? Let's see, the other thing, so this idea, the new electronic management devices to be benign, they must remain under political and not exclusively expert control. This is really interesting. I think this is a
Yeah,
really
that is interesting and debatable. Also, well, not the whole of it, but the exclusively experts control. I'm just like, should we really have like DIY hydrogen bomb kit? Because maybe that's not a good idea.
So I want to bring up 2 points here. Is one, I think that, yeah, it's a really good question, right? Like, can you let someone make a hydrogen bomb? But I guess I want to say, one thing is that for technology that complicated, I don't think it's possible, like just physically to, because we are a very interdependent species, and usually most of our creative capacity, especially on a scale that big, relies on cooperation. And so I wonder to what extent, how much can one person really do on their own is my first question for
Well,
that.
I think the hydrogen bomb was really a bad example of what I was trying to get across because, yeah, first of all, it's really, really improbable that there will ever be such a thing as a DIY hydrogen bomb. I think maybe a more clear example of what I'm trying to get across would be like a genetic lab. Like I can see that in the future. I can see like create your own genome or something. That is something that does not seem too far-fetched to me.
Right.
But is that really something we want? Is that something we want for anyone to be able to create some kind of virus?
Right. And so that
So
goes back to sort of this other question that might be that comes up for me when we think about this idea of expert control and the idea of maybe having a legitimate authority, right? And I think that's something we think about a lot as anarchists, right? Like when
Yeah.
is authority warranted and when is it not warranted? And sort of this question, I think maybe a lot of people might want to jump to the assumption that maybe in an anarchist society everything would be kind of freely
No.
democratic, right? But I think that's not the case, right? There are situations where
Yeah.
somebody could take a temporary authority over a limited scope, and that would make sense.
Yeah, and epistemic authority is one of these times. Like, if you know something more, be it by formation or by, yeah, I can only think about formation, but if you know something more on a subject, it just makes sense that you have authority over someone else who does not know as much on this subject. And that doesn't mean that the person who knows more has authority over every single aspect of that other
the issue
person's
is
life.
there's a big problem here
Yeah.
because if you create a structure where someone can have this exclusive control over something as important as the genetics, as you said, then you create a nice background there for actors with socially misaligned incentives to overtake that part of structure through unethical practices and then use it for their own goals to advance their own ideologies of authoritarianism, for example. So this is basic of anarchists too, that the moment you create such a structure, people who want to get power, they just opportunistically try to take over the structure. And this is, for example, one of the biggest problems of Marxist Leninist rhetoric So I don't know if I agree with you that much here, to be honest. Uh, I will just say, well, you would have to really go over this example more because I would say that, let's say you create, if you conspiratorially try to create some kind of DIY genetic line to spread the virus, then my only answer to that is, well, you seem to not be aligned towards socially beneficial behavior if you spread the virus. But for that, the best people will be able to counter that is to know that there are viruses, and the moment virus starts to spread, people will have to get socialized to quarantine and to create vaccines and to possibly, well, put some pressure on the person who created the virus for some just repercussion towards them for this to not happen again. And you will not really be able to affect this otherwise, because in anarchies, you don't really have. I don't know how you say it, because either you can just create in your own basement this type of lab and spread the virus, or you cannot. For this to not be possible, you essentially have to have cameras in every room, in every place, and this is totalitarian as fuck. So I would say this will happen at some point if we develop technologically, because there will happen such a person. And my answer to that is hopefully we are able to quarantine, and we are able to just create vaccines, and we are able to take repercussions towards such a person. If the moment we create some authority, sorry, like it depends on the authority, but the moment we create some like exclusive authority over some crucial resource, people with misaligned social incentives will try to overtake it to get power.
But I think this is where the political process comes in, right? And I think this is why political processes are really important, and this is why Ivan Illich is sort of emphasizing this, because while we do want some kind of expertise to have control over some technologies, we also need to be able to choose who those experts are going to be, right? So yeah, I think that's a good point, right? Like I think that both things can be true, right? Right.
Yeah, that's what he's saying here. To be benign must remain under political and not exclusively experts' control.
Mm-hmm.
To make it more concrete, I would say examples would be open source software, maybe compared to closed source software, because it's much easier to change it. Possibly something like that, like from like, let's say that's something that's happening. Apart from that, like with open source, you can always fork it and change it however you want, which is very nice. Apart from that, when, I don't know, requests for increasing the privacy of capitalists on social media, that's where people request some changes, right? Like, I don't know, like just throwing this out, I guess.
So, yeah, I think maybe that might be something that could come up later, just sort of the idea of what commons do exist now electronically. I think things like code sharing is a really good place, even though GitHub is owned by some corporate entity, unfortunately, but the spirit of that, right, is still that's the idea of the commons. But let's read the next segment to get to the concept of the commons. Okay, reading now. In the 13 minutes still left to me on this rostrum, I will clarify a distinction that I consider fundamental to political ecology. I shall distinguish the environment as commons from the environment as resource. On our ability to make this distinction depends not only the construction of a sound theoretical ecology, but also, and more importantly, effective ecological jurisprudence. Minasan, how I wish at this point that I were a pupil trained by your Zen poet, the great Basho. Then, perhaps in a bare 17 syllables, I could express the distinction between the commons within which people's subsistence activities are embedded and resources that serve for the economic production of those commodities on which modern survival depends. If I were a poet, perhaps I would make this distinction so beautifully and incisively that it would penetrate your hearts and remain unforgettable. Unfortunately, I am not a Japanese poet. I must speak to you in English, a language that during the last 100 years has lost the ability to make this distinction. And in addition, I must speak through translation. Only because I may count on the translating genius of Mr. Marasutu do I dare recover Old English meanings with a talk in Japan. So, commons is an Old English word. According to my Japanese friends, it is quite close to the meaning that, I'm going to butcher this, irai still has in Japanese. Commons, like irai, I can't pronounce it, I'm sorry, is a word which in pre-industrial times was used to designate certain aspects of the environment. People called commons those parts of the environment for which customary law extracted specific forms of which customary law exacted specific forms of community respect. People called commons that part of the environment which lay beyond their own thresholds and outside their own possessions, to which, however, they had recognized claims of usage, not to produce commodities, but to provide for the subsistence of their households. The customary law which humanized the environment by establishing the commons was usually unwritten. It was unwritten law not only because people did not care to write it down, but because what it protected was a reality much too complex to fit into paragraphs. The law of the commons regulates the right of way, the right to fish and the right to hunt, to graze, and to collect wood or medicinal plants in the forest. An oak tree might be in the commons. Its shade in the summer is reserved for the shepherd and his flock. Its acorns are reserved for the pigs of the neighboring peasants. Its dry branches serve as fuel for the widows of the village. Some of its fresh twigs in the springtime are cut as ornaments for the church, and at sunset it might be a place for the village assembly. When people spoke about the commons, they designated an aspect of the environment that was limited, that was necessary for the community's survival, that was necessary for different groups in different ways, but which, in a strictly economic sense, was not perceived as scarce. So that was a really long passage, but I thought maybe I'd just get through the whole kind of concept of the commons because it's so important.
Yeah, so I think like this part is it's very nice from a perspective of some monarchies. Like it's very cool. This designation, this differentiation between resource to extract from and the commons to subsist on. I think it's very crucial given what's happening these days with our climate catastrophe. That's quite likely to destroy this whole civilization.
Yeah.
Yeah. So like it's very compatible with like green anarchies, with social ecology or deep ecology, with degrowth, with all these ideas, with solar punk to some extent. So this is very cool.
I think that's a really useful distinction for us, sort of the idea of the environment as a commons and the idea of the environment as resources. It might be worth maybe spending a little bit of time talking about what a commons is because it's so rare, right?
These days, I barely can think about a piece of anything that is not owned by somebody, which is
I can give you an example. I
go.
can give you a great example. So great example is free and open source software movement. Open source movement is much closer to anarchies than most activities of anarchists because of how it works. So that there people can just fork the software and change it however they want. So they split very naturally. Whereas with anarchists, sometimes we don't want to split and we sort of agree to some centralizing hierarchical decision-making procedure, right? Sometimes we will not be able to split that easily when we have disagreements and we'll just go over the like direct democracy method. Whereas in open software, you can just have an idea on this and change the software. You can just create a fork, which is like a copy. You can just copy it at 1 second and you can change it a bit. And if people like that, they will develop on your idea. And then if two persons have two ideas how to change the software, they can just once again torque it and create different versions based on your version, etc. And you can continue this process. So to be honest, I find this extremely anarchist in one way, and in the other way, whole open source movement can be considered digital commons because they are not even used to extract profit from you. Linux, stuff like that, like Linux or like Fediverse, is all available completely for free, and it's even mostly financed through gift economy, right? Because it's financed through optional donations.
So I'm just gonna be devil's advocate, right? And I'm gonna. So have you ever read Bullshit Jobs by David Graeber?
It's on my to read list.
I have read the essay.
Amazing.
I've just read the shorter essay, and the book I have on my drive somewhere, but I have like 100 books. So
I love David Graeber. But so when he talks about the bullshitization of work, right? Like not only like the phenomenon of bullshit jobs, but also that jobs that aren't bullshit have become bullshitified or something like that. So one of the examples he goes into is software development, where what's happened is that a lot of these software companies are taking advantage of open source, and instead of hiring labor to develop innovative software, they use the fact that software developers tend to be really passionate about what they do, and they're going to develop it for free and put it out for free. And so what ends up happening in a lot of kind of software engineering jobs, they end up being kind of, again, like the labor is degraded, right? Like they end up wanting to hire cheaper people to do more tedious tasks, like maybe troubleshoot some, because maybe somebody put some innovative software up for free, but it has all kinds of bugs in it and it needs to be ironed out because they just kind of did it in their free time. And so that's where a company comes in, grabs it, and then, fixes it and then puts a clamp on it and sells it back to people. And so anyways, I think that one thing that's problematic and what I find really frustrating about sort of this capitalist world is just sort of how good capitalism is at recuperating things and at appropriating. And it happens on so many levels, right? Like it happens culturally, right? Like where
they will sell you anarchist shirts.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Sell you the hairdos and the styles and the music, right? And that's
they will like create games about cyberpunk as like cool stuff, like there's this famous video game about like cyberpunk is so cool. It's like this was a dystopia, dude. This was like a fucking dystopian vision.
Right. So yeah, I think that's it's interesting because we can come up with all of these examples and it's so, I don't know, it's just so insidious the way, like until we change the whole system, it's just going to get co-opted and eaten up. It's just frustrating.
For that, I would have to say, I think spreading the radical message is very important because I agree with you. Capitalists love to take over the crucial part and put some property construct on it, like in terms of technology, usually some intellectual property, right? They will like, for example, they will have like, you cannot really have PC, like personal computer these days. I feel like that's competitive in most tasks without using some kind of closed source or patented part. Like you can have a software that's close to that when you have some versions of Linux that just run free software. Occasionally, like even with drivers, there are like NVIDIA drivers that are unofficial, I think, but you need still some GPU and CPU. You need actual hardware, and a lot of hardware is not yet open. Like I feel like, from what I know, open hardware is slowly happening, but usually if you want to have strong graphic card, you need to buy NVIDIA or AMD. Same with like CPUs and stuff like that. So they have this crucial monopoly over some crucial resource in terms of like GPU, for example, and through that they extract the rent or stuff like that, or like try to get profit, which is like their strategy, unfortunately. And to counter that, you have to delegitimize intellectual property in hands of people, and you have to create wholly open standards based on which people will be able to develop their own architectures of hardware, for example, and just put the architectures online, for example, and then we could just produce them and just not buy from NVIDIA anymore, and we'll be able to maybe like just have a open hardware standard for GPUs, for like graphic cards, and just someone will create it and you will buy it from them, and you will not help the capitalist enterprise. Like I feel like the vision is possible, but for that it's very important to get the full project of like anarchies, for example. If you just have pieces, I would just say a bit more like they are very good at taking specific parts and just they always are fighting for the actual ownership. Like I will just give this example, which is a bit relevant but not that much, of Valve. There's this video game company, Valve. They sort of tried to pretend that they did like a worker cooperative. They did this they do this all the time. There's those capitalists or capitalist enterprises or projects where they pretend like they do something egalitarian and then they say it doesn't work. And through this, they delegitimize whole idea. They just had horizontal decision making inside of still capitalist enterprise where workers were not co-owners of the enterprise. And through this, they said that it doesn't work, which is nonsense because, well, those people were still employees, but now they had to self-manage. They did not get the extra gain of actual ownership of the company. And this is something that capitalists do like almost all the time from what I see, where they are able occasionally to do one of these experiments where they will just take a part and work on it to delegitimize it, for example, or to gain some extra points of some like egalitarianism or freedom. But they always will fight for the actual ownership, for the actual for the actual monopoly on some crucial resource or some crucial aspect without which you lose a lot, because through this they get their advantage. And for that, it's very important to deconstruct whole notion of, for example, private property or intellectual property.
I think, I think that sort of idea of selling people the partial package, I think that's a big part of the liberal Kool-Aid that people end up drinking. Do you know what I mean? Like just sort of
yeah, I know what you mean.
like it's gonna be okay. We could just have like ethical corporations, or maybe if somebody ran it right? So it's I think
ESG
that what you've described, like the way you've described it, that's a big part of how we get people to buy into this idea that, it just needs to be fixed a little bit, or we just need corporations to be a little more ethical, quote unquote.
Yeah. Capitalism works, but not this specific variation of capitalism. We just need to tweak it a little bit more.
Right. Yeah, so on one hand, you never want to have any regulations because that's big government. On the other hand, capitalism is amazing when it's strongly regulated, right? Like that's the magic, right? So you have to have small government and no regulation and a lot of regulation to regulate capitalism. Capitalism is the best system. It just creates monopolies, but that's cronies, right? And like they will just change arguments in circle.
Right. That's right. Go back and forth. So, so actually for this segment, there's a couple of things that I think we should go over, and that's kind of this idea, scarcity, right? Like just this idea that where he talks about the example of the oak tree and all its different uses and all the different ways people can use it, and it's not ever perceived as being scarce, right? And I think that's so key, right? to sort of the system we're trapped under, right? We're all led to
Of
believe
course.
that everything is scarce, right?
Yeah, we don't have enough. We need to do more. We need to produce more. We need to buy more. I don't think well, not every single things, of course, but I think we are largely living in a post-scarcity world. We have
Yes.
so much of everything. We have too much. People have too much. People have so much that some people don't have enough. It's crazy. Yeah.
It's weird. It's weird. There's a lot of most scarcity is artificial these days. It's completely
Yeah.
artificial. Like even the idea that the food is not approaching free food is a joke. Like
Yeah.
millions of tons of food are wasted in every country of Europe. I think I may be bullshitting here, but from what I remember in Poland, maybe I'm bullshitting, but from what I remember, 6 million tons
It's worldwide, it's 5 billion tons.
by year.
Yep. Wasted.
Yeah,
5 billion. We produce 8 billion. We produce 9.2 billion and we waste like 4.8. I don't know. We
yes,
waste
and
like
yes, and you heard that, right? It's like consider this, like just think about that, right? This is a joke that people are sometimes still hungry. There, in
yeah.
almost every country, there are some hungry people. Like you read, even in Europe or United States, there are hungry kids
Yeah.
that cannot afford to have enough food. Uh, with this word, it's just because of all of the system that tries to control you and tries to use you as to just extract as much from you and then throw you out, or just if you don't want to submit, the system will hurt you and possibly torture you and kill you if you are too loud with your activities.
One really important thing, I mean, obviously, we could point to all of the wastefulness in our lifestyles, but I think there's something deeper he's getting at in when we imagine the different uses of an oak tree, right? And I think that, I mean, this is just sort of beyond thinking about how wasteful we are, because that's clear, right? But even just kind of thinking beyond, like, how can we imagine different ways of doing things, right? And I have this image in my head of an oak tree, right? And he's describing all these different ways the oak tree is used, and how if it's used that way, it could be used for hundreds of years by everyone, right? As long as the oak tree is alive. But as soon as you cut that oak tree and split it up, as soon as you treat it as a resource wood, then it does become scarce, quite literally, right? Because as soon as you cut it up, and as soon as the wood's all used up, it's done, right? So so I think it also has to do with sort of the framing of how we think of natural resources, or I'm using the word, right? That of how we think of the environment, right? And I use thinking of it as, we're so programmed to think of them as resources, and how just shifting our thinking a little bit can make an oak tree last for hundreds of years rather than for maybe the few years it takes to use up the wood, or less. So, um, this kind of leads into this idea of the tragedy of the commons, right? And
Yep.
just how. Do you want to take that over?
I can't recap just like a big overview of what is the tragedy of the commons. I do have here a little infographic which was made by Stevens Planning and Design LLC. Anyway, it's imagine an open pasture shared by multiple cattle owners. Each owner increased their herd to maximize their benefits. With an unregulated resource, this is logical, since the benefit is enjoyed by the individual and the impact shared by all. This leads to the ultimate overgrazing of the pasture. Basically, we have something, and according to a capitalist logic, according to an individualist logic, the best thing to do for you is to just take the most for yourself, because then everyone lose the same except you, because you gain the most. And that's dumb as fuck. That is so dumb. I don't think anyone thought like that before we got that logic so ingrained in our brain, because everybody lose at the end. Everybody lose once the oak tree is cut. Everybody lose when when we sold everything we had to make some imaginary profit. So yeah, the tragedy of the commons is dumb, and it's not a good rhetoric. That's what I have to say about it.
It also makes assumptions about human nature, right?
Hmm.
And I think that's kind of one of
Yeah.
the things that is inculcated in our brains, right? From very
Humans are the big bads.
yeah, yeah, and just kind of this idea, this is very simplistic understanding of Darwinism, right? That only the fittest survive when, a more complex understanding can, looks at the bigger picture and looks at cooperation. Um,
Mutual aid.
yeah. And so even if so I think one of the arguments that makes the tragedy of the commons argument problematic is that actually it is in our interest to collaborate, right?
Yeah.
And to cooperate. And so
Long-term interest anyway.
yeah, and so if we were to take raw self-interest um in a as a bigger picture, right? The bigger picture of raw self-interest, it would include cooperation.
It's funny how this idea, this strategy of the commons, it was. I sort of find it funny how, to be honest, the more I think about it, cannot you sort of use similar reasoning against private property? I don't know, like it seems like a lot of the time that that's what capitalists do, where they throw out some mess into this a lot of resources, and through this they affect the whole ecosystem. Like the point is the solution is not a solution, right? Because suddenly, because there is a owner, they can do anything about the thing, even if there are other stakeholders in the thing, they cannot affect the change because they are not actual owners. So through this, you have the
Stakeholders is a
abstract
very
owner.
important concept.
Yes, you have the abstract owner that can live on the other continent, for example, and that person will have exclusive control over something, and that person can just use what they have for their own gain, and they can just leave a mess there. And there's people nearby, our stakeholders, they cannot do anything because of this notion of exclusive control, let's say. So
It's
this
dark
is
magic.
yeah.
This actually reminds me of I'm gonna bring up David Graeber again because I guess I'm a bit of a
Please
stan.
do.
And I think he talks about this either in Debt, the book Debt, or in Dawn of Civilization. So this idea of oh my God, I lost my train of thought. Oh yeah, ownership, right? Like what our concept of ownership is, right? And he points out that actually it's very specific to Roman, like this concept of ownership that we have. I guess he's an anthropologist, so he's thought about this a lot. Most cultures, their concept of ownership is related to the responsibility that you have for taking care of something, right? Whereas the Roman concept of ownership is the idea that you can do whatever you want to it, right? And so I thought that idea was really interesting, right? Because we kind of took sort of a lot of Western civilization is built on, the Renaissance, grabbing these ideas from trying to revive these ideas from Roman times. And that seems to be one idea that's really pervasive in our culture, just how we think about owning things, right? That it's
Yeah.
about, as Michael was saying, doing what we want with it rather than taking care of it.
It's pretty near the concept of usufruct, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing it properly. But yeah, there's like three natural rights that are in the concept of private property these days, and the first one is using it, which makes a lot of sense. When you own something, you want to be able to use it. The fruct part is being able to collect the fruct of whatever you own, which is also all right, but like with a couple of asterisks there. And the third one, I don't remember the Latin name, but it's about being able to break the object
Right.
and like to to break it, to alienate it, to take it apart, to whatever. And that is a very interesting concept to me because when you think about it, why would you need that right over any object?
Mhm.
And why would you need why do you want the right to like, I don't know, break a car? It's kind of weird.
Yeah,
But yeah.
it is. And I think when David Graeber talks about it, he specifically does say that as well, like the right to break something. And but you know, we're taught that, yeah, if it's yours, right, you go to a store, you break something, you own it.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah,
It's
you
so
pay for it.
right, right. It's so ingrained. Um, that's really interesting. Um,
You wrote something here about the fact that that law was unwritten. Can
oh
you develop that? Yeah,
yeah,
I'm
yeah, that was
interested.
something I was thinking about when I first read this and just let's see. I think about sort of codes of conduct. So there's a couple of things that occur to me. One is just human codes of conduct, how so many of those are unwritten.
Oh
And
yeah.
it made me think a little bit. So there's this book, The Dispossessed by Ursula Le Guin.
Oh my
With
God, I've been recommended that so many times by a good friend of mine
oh
called
yeah, you could read
Frankie.
it. Yeah.
Yeah,
It's but what I love about it is I feel like it gives a really good picture of what an anarchist society would actually look like. And it's not really that utopian. It's just like she's very practical and she has a really good understanding of human nature, which is what I lo loved about it. But I think to a large extent, you know, she underscores the role that social pressure plays in modifying people's behavior um, to a large extent, right? Like how people are treated, just what behaviors ostracize people from one another, right? And I think that does a lot to mold how our society comes out. So right now, right, in our current society, we're rewarded for being selfish, right? Like we really are.
yeah,
And
it's
to mold our behavior, right? And it's not, and these laws aren't written, right? But it's just sort of like you don't get ostracized as you should for exhibiting psychopathic behavior. Um,
well, no, you get a CEO job.
yeah. Exactly. Yeah. So that's I think that that's what's
Yeah,
interesting to me about sort of this idea of the laws being unwritten, how so
it's
much
true.
that's passed on and so much that structures our society is ultimately sort of these cultural codes that
That is very true, and I'm yeah, yeah, no, that is such a great idea. The implicit rules and biases we have in our society, the way in which it seems as the I've got scolded once when I was much younger for like giving money to a homeless person because that person was gonna go buy drugs with it. Shit, I would I would buy drugs too in that place.
yeah.
But it's it's just like all those little things that we consider to be unnatural and no, don't do that. That person somehow deserved it. That person somehow earned that place in the streets. It's yeah, it's kind of a posteriori justification of our respective position, except our position have been gifted to us. Yeah.
Yes, it's unfortunate because it's but from what I know, some people have stronger inclinations towards these types of reasoning. They believe in this just word hypothesis. I think that's what it's called. That the word is just, and you get what you should deserve, or something like that, which is interesting. If you are born into an abusive family, I guess you deserved it, right? If you became homeless because you were like, I don't know, queer person and you had queerphobic parents, you deserved it, I guess, for them. If
Yeah.
you became multi-millionaire through heritage, then you deserve it. So, but as you can see, I think those type of persons, they don't reflect much about the world. I feel like they have issues with this stronger reasoning, and they just have. I feel like they have inclination to not really ponder these type of things because they may be overwhelmed by the complexity. So it's easier for them to dehumanize someone who is from their perspective below them. So they will automatically like someone who is from their perspective above them, and they will dehumanize someone who is from their perspective below them. And I think this is what was like right wing politics is about. It's about preserving the hierarchy, right? Like that's how a lot of the
Yeah.
time it's defined. It's a tendency to preserve the hierarchy. So there are some persons who have inclinations towards preservation of hierarchy, and they create arguments around it. As you said, they will argue that people who are persons who are below them, they deserve the place they got because they were bad persons. So it's their logic. And we, as say, like leftists, we strive in the egalitarian direction. We usually think much strongly about structural incentives of the system, about like pure luck, about these various problems. But to extend this, I've read that usually people like radical leftists they prefer to think systemically, whereas those, let's say, conservatives, they have inclinations towards having issues with systemic thinking. They seem to get easily overwhelmed by those type of argumentations. And this is, to me, if it's true, then to me it's a very interesting question of how is that changeable for an education.
I think that's a really good question, right? Because there's so much indoctrination in our system, right? And it's so deep, and it takes a lot of work to start kind of unthinking these things. And it's a very natural thing for humans to want to believe in a just world, right? Like it's just what we want to do. And I've had interesting insights since I've had a kid in just seeing how kids think and how the media that's thrown at them kind of shapes their brains, right? And what media is thrown at them. So for example, I think it's really unnatural when we think about the world the way it is now, right? It took a tremendous amount of violence to shape the world as it is now. And I think David Graeber's depth is really good at illuminating that, just how much, like, it just took so much violence to kind of force people into this system that we have now. So there's that, right? So that's generations and generations of trauma, right? That just builds on each other. So I think there's some level to that, right? Like we need to think about unpacking that trauma, those generations of trauma. But I think there's also something in the way we educate our children. And I think about a lot of I never thought about children's programming before. And this is one thing of having a kid so late in life, is that you don't think about these things and then suddenly you do, and you have this perspective because it's, I'm so far away from it. So a lot of kids stuff, there's like princesses, kings and queens, right? There's just like this idea that just starts from like day one of media consumption of a hierarchy, right? Of some people being special over others, right? Like that's immediately like we have the imagination to come up with people with magical powers, but we don't have the imagination to come up with stories about systems that aren't kingdoms, right? Like it's all right, like Frozen. It's all the same like medieval structure, right? But it's there's magic in it. They have the imagination for that, but not
Sorry,
for
I have to interrupt you. So I will tell you just my own like experience because for me it did not happen what you said. I think just by pure luck. Like when I think about movies that I watched when I was a kid, that I remember, like I liked Star Wars. It has very strongly anti-authoritarian motive. I remember Shrek, which is it's completely reversal. It's like very postmodernist. Like I really like Shrek for that. I like Wall-E, which is once again about like destruction of environment and like I remember when I was a young kid, I really liked this movie. It was called like Spirit, Stallion of the Cimarron. It's about like horse cooperating with an Indian against white colonizers, and I loved it when I was a kid. So maybe I got just lucky through like the choice of movies, but the ones that I have watched were strongly against hierarchy. Like the Spirit, the Spirit Stallion of the Cimarron, like it's like Indian and a horse fighting against white colonizers. So it's like very indigenous and like pro animals.
Well, this is
So
arguing. I think culture is important, right? Like I think that's part of the argument I think you're supporting the argument I'm making that culture is really important and that when we
yes,
think about sort of the culture that's popularized so much kind of supports the ideology we have. And it does I think that when we ask the question like how can we start changing that, I think culture is really big. I think cultural production that's kind of why I decided at one point I want to study culture instead of science. I just feel like that's going to be the thing, right? That's going to be the thing
Yeah.
that gets people, that changes the way people think. I also want to say something else really quick about children's entertainment that I noticed. I think the idea of violence is really unnatural for children. And I think that a lot of children's TV or children's entertainment I have a hypothesis, and I don't know, but a lot of it aims to kind of justify the use of violence because you see so many of these kid stories, right? Like they have the bad guy, right? And the bad guy is so
Yeah.
irredeemable that they have to kill him, that they have to use violence against the bad guy at the end, right? Like, and there are a lot of movies out there that, to be fair, do have conflict without violence, right? But the run-of-the-mill kid story, right, is like big scary bad guy gets defeated, gets killed at the end, right? And I just wonder to what extent does this narrative start to normalize violence or start to normalize this idea that, well, it's acceptable and necessary, right? Just a thought.
yes, that's quite interesting to be honest. I think this is somewhat interesting. There are two lenses here from my side. So one side is I remember in video games there used to be a lot of talk about how violence in video game changes a person, changes a kid, for example. I don't know, like in the point is in a lot of video games you can kill many characters. You can like in GTA series you can just kill a lot of persons, just you can walk around and just shoot at them, and like people don't really do this type of mass shooter sprees. uh, so it seems like they are able to some extent separate themselves from the art, but on the other hand it may affect you, especially the way I look at this. What you said from this other lens would be this normalizes a bit the concept that when you justify that someone is the body, you can use violence against the body, right? And the violence against the body is the good thing. And this, I don't think is the worst thought, but you have to be much more careful with it. You have to be extremely careful with that. If you are not careful, there can be too much violence. Like it's possible that the problem with okay, big problem can be when the body is like ugly, like when that happens, and like his ugliness justifies the violence. Then the kiddo can have this notion that when the kiddo doesn't like just feels like doesn't like at first sight someone that they can use the violence against them. I wonder how much that can propagate into the humanization of the outgroup, because the body usually is not that charismatic. The body is like ugly and it's not charismatic, and it's like and it's very easy to like put that in the direction of the humanization of an outgroup and using violence against the outgroup. I guess maybe I'm just throwing this out.
That's really interesting. And just all of these attributes that we associate with the bad guy. That's interesting. I wonder if there's so this idea of things being written down, and I wanted to connect it a little bit with Ivan Illich being quite anti-modernist in his thinking, because so much of the project of modernity has been about measuring and recording and positivism, right? And so I think that might be maybe a point to make or something to unpack, and just kind of thinking about how other scholars have kind of, I'm thinking about like Giorgio Agamben, who's like, who problematizes the idea of writing down human rights, right? And just he doesn't like I'm not an expert on this. I'm not a philosopher, but he doesn't like the idea of human rights as codified law. He sees that as being problematic because it reduces the human experience, right? It reduces humanity to the set of codified laws, and in the end, leads to disastrous things where some armies or some superpowers can use human rights to attack countries, for example, right?
I would
Very
just
much.
say a bit about that, what you said. So it seems to me like this, broadly speaking, is the whole problem of law and of what legitimizes enforcement of law. Like that's like the typical, basic anarchist, let's say, like where law is considered like to be usually the justification. It's created by ruling classes to justify how they can oppress you. If they break it, because on average they enforce it, they don't see them breaking the law, right? And that's a problem with the concept. You just create a justification for the stronger, for the ruler to use it. That person can break it because they are ruling, they are enforcing they are the one who enforces the break of the law. They don't have to enforce the law when they break it.
Mm-hmm. And this is, yeah, and I think that sort of questioning of law and written law is another resonance between Ivan Illich and anarchists like us, right? Like I think that's another interesting point of.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I wonder how much of that is like written law, like because I see where you can say that he may lean a bit conservative even from what he wrote, because here he seemed to sort of have a problem with actual written law, but he does not mind the natural law that much, which natural. When I hear natural, I usually expect you to justify something oppressive. To be honest, these days,
Yeah. Well,
it's not all the time used that way, but there were many places where using that was the
nat
argument for why you oppress someone. Please speak. Sorry.
and then natural law is often used as a like everything box of like everything that I think should be respected is natural law, including property often.
Yep.
And this brings us to the end of part 1 of our reading of Silence is a Commons by Ivan Illich. Thank you so much for joining us. Until next time.
Granddad, what do you do when you can't do nothing, but there's nothing you